Hi all, and welcome to the next class on civil war in France, which is looking at the third address of Marxist to the International Working Men's Association. George is going to cover off on some of the stuff about the Prussian War, I think, and then
At the Franco-Prussian War,
and then I'm going to quickly go over the last bit of the Paris Commune pamphlet, or the Civil War in France pamphlet. I did say to the others, I haven't gone into a lot of detail. I think most of us know what it is, and if we can pick it up next week if you want to do the details. And Marx sort of assumes that we all know, like he's writing not long after it happened, so he assumes that everybody knows who's who, and it is all very familiar, I would have said. Okay.
Okay. Do you see the PowerPoint now?
Yep.
Okay. 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 Now, the explicit position of the International is against national war. Basically, the whole presentation is structured around Marx's theory of war. Okay. Now, the position of the International is against national war, including civil war, and for peace and peaceful resolution of conflicts on the basis of the principles of morality and justice. He writes, we define the foreign policy aimed at by the International. He's referring to the address to the International in 1864. In these words, vindicate the simple laws of morals and justice, which ought to govern the relations of private individuals as the rules paramount on the intercourse of nations. Now, there is a set of ethical imperatives, positive, that ought to govern as guiding ideas, even if in practice they may be violated. These guiding ideals must guide private relations and the relations among nations. This demand suggests that an international ethical order must be established that eschews war as a means of resolving interstate conflicts. So there is an explicit primacy given to peace in any kind of situation, in regulating relationships on peace on the basis of morals and ideas of justice, regulating both individual relations and international relations. Now, Bonaparte, who instrumentalized the launching of periodic wars in order to perpetuate his usurpation of power, was from the start hostile to the International's peace platform and persecuted its representatives in France who campaigned against the plebiscite. Bonaparte proclaimed a plebiscite in 1869 or 70, I think. And the International came out against participation of the French citizens to the plebiscite, arguing publicly that voting the plebiscite was voting despotism at home and war abroad. Okay, that was the official position of the International. There is no clearer illustration that the Bonapartist regime was deemed a warmongering and brutal despotism by Marx and the International Association of Working Women. The Second Empire, and I quote this, which summarizes very nicely, is real despotism and mock democratism, says Marx. Now, the very existence of the International Association in a historical period that no international bodies of any kind existed shows the avant-garde character of its foundation and the latent future nation-states interdependency that necessarily led to the establishment of a range of international interstate organizations. In other words, at that historical period, there were no international organizations expressing the interdependency of nations on a global scale or in the world market, even though relationships existed. International was a kind of prototype institution having such a kind of international character. Now, the war plot of July 1870 is but an amended edition of the coup d'etat of December 1851, whose proclamation took everyone by surprise. Though Prussia appeared to enter a war of defense, Marx suggests that it was a product of Bonaparte conspiring with Bismarck, the latter intending to quash popular opposition at home. There was a tumult, social tumult in Prussia at that period, and annexing Germany to the Hohenzollern dynasty. Now, if Prussia had lost the war with Austria in 1866, but she didn't lose the war, then Germany would have been overrun by the French in alliance with Prussia. In other words, if Prussia was defeated in the war against Austria, then it would have allied with France in order to overrun Austria. Marx ties the war with the attitude and prospects of the German working class. If it allows the war to become an aggressive war against the French people, then it will suffer the miserable fate it befell upon it during the Napoleonic Wars. Various collective proclamations of solidarity for the French workmen were expressed based on the principle, and this is an important principle, the workmen of all countries are our friends, and the despots of all countries our enemies. So there is a clear, if you like, class principle, class-based principle against any form of despotism. Marx makes three predictions that turned out to be real historical future outcomes. First, that the war will spell the death knell of the Second Empire, and it actually led to its demise. Second, that the war, instead of resulting to a permanent prevention of future wars between Germany and France, as prophesied by military experts, politicians, and professors, etc., will convert this war into a European institution. In other words, instead of the war ending all future wars, it will be nothing else than the initial step for continuous future war, making kind of institution, let's say. The subsequent two world wars, with Germany and France as main opponents, testify to the incisive logic of understanding geopolitical conflict. There is a historical path dependence in the conflicts of great powers. Possession of Alsace-Lorraine, which was one of the main area, many area that the conflict between France and Prussia concerned, was one of the causes of World War I also. After the defeat of Germany in the First World War, in the Versailles Treaty, the terms set down by the French were imbued with a revanchist spirit, overcompensating for the lost Franco-Prussian War. In other words, the loss of the war by France in the Franco-Prussian War resulted in a kind of a revanchist policy in terms of putting punitive terms on Germany after the end of the First World War. So it is a kind of continuation of the situation that had erupted 40 years earlier.
Yes.
Marx identifies, and actually there was a conflict. There was a conflict in France at that time between the Prime Minister Clemenceau and the incoming president of the French Republic over the setting down the conditions, because his name was, I have written, it was Paul Deschanel. Deschanel insisted that we shouldn't put any kind of punitive measures on Germany in the Versailles Treaty, because that would create a lot of animosity on the part of the Germans, and we will pay later the price for doing so. But his recommendation was not supported, and everybody, the parliament and the power elite, supported Clemenceau's position that we should put very harsh and punitive terms on Germany. Now, Marx identifies an ideology of pan-Germanism and a claim to have secure frontiers as strong drivers for eruption of wars in Europe. So his third prediction is that, given that the logic of securing frontiers concerns also the eastern borders, he foretells a future military engagement with Russia, except if there is a social revolution. He has in mind the possibility of a future social revolution in Russia in the meantime, before a war to the Eastern Front erupts. And he calls it an unlikely event. Now, from the second address. The second address was drafted a few days after France lost the war on 2nd September 1870. 2 days later, on September 4th, the Republic was proclaimed in Paris following the workers' rising. The Republic itself became a target of dismemberment by the German middle classes. Marx fulminates against the logic of militarism that shapes the thinking of state policy. Geographical areas and territories were seen as military fortifications for defense and attack against neighbors. He deems such primacy of military consideration both an absurdity and an anachronistic principle. It leads to a self-defeating logic of securing national borders by annexing adjacent areas and harbors perennial wars than lasting peace and security. I quote, "If limits are to be fixed by military interests, there will be no end to claims, because every military line is necessarily faulty and may be improved by annexing some more outlying territory. And moreover, they can never be fixed finally and fairly, because they always must be imposed by the conqueror upon the conqueror, and consequently carry within them the seed of fresh war." So what he's saying to us here is that wars of national liberation are inherent in any conquered country. In other words, in order to secure your militarily your national frontiers or borders, and you do a kind of conquering war against your neighbor, pretty soon a kind of national liberation war will erupt in order to liberate to have the liberation of the conquered country. So rather than imposing a kind of peace, let's say through strength, we have the ground of new national wars of liberation being created. So this is a kind of self-defeating logic. You never secure national security by extending and occupying further territorial areas. Now, the logic of autocracy and empire building necessarily leads to military confrontation. Two empires cannot coexist the one next to the other, but they are entangled in a zero-sum game. He writes, such is the law of the old political system of great powers. Within its pale, the gain of one state is the loss of the other. So in the coexistence of empires, there is no win-win situation as often it is being presented by various diplomatic or state government interests. It is a zero-sum game, and by necessity, it leads to military conflict. You cannot have two empires coexisting with each other. And Marx calls it a law, the law of the old political system. Now, as to the proclaimed republic, Marx advises caution to the working class, lest it suffer terribly, knowing the quality of the provisional government and the approaching army at the gates of Paris. He writes, that republic has not subverted the throne, but only taking its place become vacant. It has been proclaimed not as a social conquest, but as a national measure of defense, the provisional government. It is in the hands of a provisional government composed partly of notorious Orleanists, partly of middle-class Republicans, upon some of whom the insurrection of 1848 has left its indelible stigma. Any attempt at upsetting the new government in the present crisis, when the enemy is almost knocking at the doors of Paris, would be a desperate folly. So this is his advice. His advice to the workers in Paris, not to insurrect, because that would be a desperate folly, given the situation, given the fact, in other words, that the provisional government is a known hostile force against the working class in Paris. His recommendation is that workers must act as citizens, avoid the delusions of the peasants that misled them during the First Empire, and take the opportunities offered by the new republic to build their own class organization. He thinks, in other words, that the new conditions allow for the possibility of the working class to start organizing itself as a class in the new republican conditions, as we will see. The French, and I quote, the French workers must perform their duties as citizens, but at the same time, they must not allow themselves to be deluded, as the French peasants allowed themselves to be deluded. They have not to recapitulate the past, but to build the future. Let them calmly and resolutely improve the opportunities of republican liberty for the work of their own class organization. To do the preparatory work for the emancipation of labor, which is the ultimate goal. Okay. Working class are called upon to be active and put pressure to end the wars. Otherwise, the present war will be but the harbinger of still deadlier international feuds. Remember that we had in the future 2 world wars, and lead in every nation to a renewed triumph over the workman by the lords of the sword, of the soil, and of capital, of the three dominant class forces. The sword, meaning the previous aristocracy and in its military expression, of the soil, of the landowning class, and of capital, of the bourgeoisie. And he ends, Vive la République. Vive la République. This is very important. Because remember, France at that time was not a republic. The republic was abolished. It was a dictatorship. Bonaparte was a dictator and was operating in the dictatorship. He was not a president, not a legitimate president or something like that. And there was no parliament anyway. The parliament was abolished. Only in 1860, there was a legislative corps created, instituted by Bonaparte, just for the semblance of having a kind of legislative body, controlled completely by him. So there was no parliament, there was no Republican parliament during his reign. So for Marx, despotic regimes and militarism are the worst conditions ensuring utter domination over workmen, whereas republican forms of government that allow conditions of liberty in social life are more conducive to democratization and class self-organization. So that's the distillation, if you like, of his analysis from the Franco-Prussian War. That we should strive, the international should strive and support republicanism in terms of, establishing conditions of republican liberty, because these are necessary for the class, for class self-organization of the working class. That's my presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, George. If I don't have any quick questions.
George, excuse me, hey, Shane, George mentioned earlier, did he have mentioned another article that he submitted? I can't see the PowerPoint. Did George make reference to another article by Marx?
There are two addresses, actually. The discussion of the Franco-Prussian War is the first address, and the second.
Oh, okay.
address.
Okay. So your reference points are the two addresses, right? That's what your analysis.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I just want, and there was nothing. You didn't introduce anything else, like, for example, when you introduced the articles on the credit mobilier, you did nothing like that this time. Your reference.
No.
Got you. I just want to be very clear on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Will I come in?
Yeah.
It's just a discussion on the chat, which everybody may or may not have read. But Marx's prediction, I don't think was right, the second prediction, because there was a long 50-odd year period from 1871 to 1914 where there was a balance of power. There were still tensions, of course, and tensions nearly led to war in the Near East in the late 1870s. Alsace-Lorraine was still a major running sore for France throughout the period. But there was no danger of a war. General Boulanger attempted a coup against the French government in 1887, but it was defeated very easily because Boulanger was wanting war. Boulanger was stressing the importance of Alsace-Lorraine. But Bismarck established himself as the symbol of an international stability based on power rather than anything else. Once the First World War broke out, then that's true. It set off a whole. It set off a period of 25 years of warfare, potential warfare. But in the period of the 50-year period, it was a period of peace. Basically, people got used to the peace. They didn't actually. They got bored with it. That was how Italian futurism began and started saying that they wanted war because war was a test of masculinity. In the period just before the First War. But the First War broke out because of the international tensions that Marx had identified. It wasn't a period of peace based on international understanding, and he was aware of that. But the fact that these tensions were held in a balance, rather like the Cold War in a sense, they were held in a balance of power where people were frightened of provoking Germany into a war, and Germany was too frightened to get involved. Well, fear is the right word. The logic was there. The logic which eventually led to 1914 was there, but it was held at bay by a different type of international system than was envisaged by the people Marx criticized.
Okay, let me 2 points. First of all, 40 years is not a significant long period in historical terms. Okay. Anyway, it's part of a segment of a lifetime of a person. But most importantly, the object of contention was the same. It was the Alsace-Lorraine area. Okay. The same cause of the war between France and Prussia was the same cause for the war in the First World War. So supposedly you didn't have a conflict or a war in between that period, but that doesn't mean that everybody accepted that the possession was legitimate. And supposedly there were various machinations around the control of this area, but in the mind of the French, it was always that this area belongs to us. So the cause is the same. That's why there is this kind of historical connection. Even though wars, have war as an alternative of politics, means that we can have also politics as an alternative to war situation. But the historical path dependency, this is the idea of that the coming world was not independent or unrelated to the previous eruption of the war between France and Prussia at the peak. That's the Marx argument.
The First War wasn't over Alsace-Lorraine. France declared war for different reasons.
Not only that.
Alsace-Lorraine is a running sore throughout the 50-year period. Many French people were infuriated and demanded that Alsace-Lorraine be returned. So I wouldn't deny that. That's what I'm saying. But the logic is there. But it was.
Wally, just quickly, and then.
Do you talk to me?
Yeah, you got your hand up, Wally, or do you?
Yeah. Very quickly, I just wanted to share, add to, not add to, but emphasize the discussion you and I had earlier, Shane, in light of George's remarks. Namely, we have to have a much better understanding of how well Marx understood what imperialism was. And I think, this is very instructive on that point. My second point is, I think that it would do us well to look at the latest formulation of what the United States called the National security strategy in terms of their recourse to the so-called spheres of influence inherent in that, in light of what Marx had to say in these two addresses. So I think if we read and study those documents and those developments in that light, it would be very helpful. That's it.
Okay, as I said with the final part here, this is the third address to the International Working Men's Association, and it's kind of summing up, but I sort of like this quote, you know, I mean, the problem with the commune is it's overloaded with so many layers of meaning and fights about, you know, who owns it and, you know, all of that stuff. So it becomes such a pivotal part of so many discussions. So I just pulled this quote out as my header in a way that, you know, that Marx reminds people in this thing that the working class did not expect miracles from the commune, you know, it's a process. So this one is written after the defeat of the Paris Commune in May 1871, and it's a shift from defense of the commune to historical assessment. And he says that, and this is the other theme, imperialism is at the same time the most prostitute and ultimate form of state power. The direct antithesis to the empire was the commune. He goes into a lot of background and details, and, you know, he sort of half assumes that you know it, and, you know, the skullduggery of the bourgeois forces is you know, strangely familiar, I think, reading this when you sort of get to the detail and figure out. So I haven't gone into a lot of detail. I assume most of us would have read this before, and if not, we can talk about more detail next week. But so we know there's a civil war. The Prussians impose a surrender. Then the bourgeois forces have to deal with Paris. They preach a lot about peace, and while negotiating the return of their surrendered prisoners, the prisoners who had surrendered had been captured by the Prussians, and those troops are then used to repress the workers in Paris. There are mass executions and imprisonments and deportations, and so Marx says the violence of the state is revealed without liberal illusions. This is from the middle of it, but I just wanted to use this to set up the theme. The civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. So Marx, this is, of course, the very famous quote that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machine and wield it for its own purposes. So what did the communards actually do? Well, they broke the power of the old state. They didn't just seize it and try to run it. The first one we already talked about was the destruction of the Standing Army defaulted to Versailles, and that left the National Guard of Paris as a standing army. And they got rid of the massive bloated bureaucracy, the old army, the priesthood, the paid government officials and all their staff, and created a different kind of government. So it was a new form. The delegates were recallable. It fused the legislative and the executive power, so they didn't have there wasn't a discussion body and an executive body and a bureaucracy that carried it out. There's again a famous quote: the commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time, and the people who were employed by that were elected by universal suffrage, and they were recallable, and they were paid workmen's wages. So they weren't a professional caste; they were working people themselves, deciding what to do and then carrying it out. So they didn't represent the workers, they were the workers, and they participated in the running of the society at all levels, in as much as that's possible in Paris in the middle of the middle of a civil war, and, you know, for 70 odd days, it was 72 days, I think. So the state gets absorbed into society. It doesn't rule over it in the way it does in bourgeois forces. So, and of course, I thought this was just something we used ourselves as a bit of a quip about elections, but this is actually, yeah, from civil war in France. Instead of deciding once every 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class is to misrepresent us in Parliament, we're going to have a commune now where we are represented in Parliament. So he doesn't use the term dictatorship of the proletariat here, but it's implicit, I think. This is, that he goes through, they break the physical power, so the police and the army are either disbanded or they go to Versailles with the official government, and that's replaced by the National Guard and policing. Their plan was to get this transitional political form, the commune, generalised across the nation. That's what would have happened. There would have been communes and sub-communes, throughout the nation, but of course that didn't happen. I say it's socialist in direction, but the measures they take aren't necessarily socialist. And Marx sums that up by saying it was essentially a working class government, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labour. So I think that's a good quote to bear in mind. That's the sort of, qualified, it's not a utopia. It's not, doesn't even say it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, but he says, this is the form that we've discovered that the working class can begin to work out what its economic emancipation might look like. He stresses the international composition of the commune. People came from all around Europe to support it, both physically and in sort of solidarity. And he runs the whole thing there of talking about comparing the commune with, with the bourgeois government. So the bourgeois, the commune and Paris held firm. Though they didn't actually fight with the Prussians directly, but the bourgeoisie betrayed France. So then you have this back and forth where he's talking about, they accused the commune of this, but in fact they were the ones. So, we're going to set fire to all the buildings, but the only people who set fire to buildings were bourgeois forces. So it's like, or in the context of war, right? Oh my God, they're kidnapping people, as if they weren't kidnapping people, or as if they didn't say, look, we've got the Archbishop of Paris here, we'll swap him for Blanqui, but the bourgeoisie wasn't having that, So the commune admitted all foreigners to the honour of dying for an immortal cause. So of course there are limits. There are political limits on what can be achieved, not moral failings on the part of people. It's, of course, incredibly isolated. There's severe limits on what is strategically possible. What Marx makes clear, look, the defeat of the commune was just by overwhelming force, by the ferocity of the response. The bourgeois forces broke into Paris, and after 72 days of commune rule, it's gone down as La Semaine Sanglante, which, forgive my French, that week, 21st to 28th of May, the Versailles government killed about 20,000 communards, 38,000 were arrested, about 15,000 were jailed, and 7,000 were deported. Some were freed as well. And I mentioned the deportations because they deported them to the French colony of New Caledonia, which is just 1,000 K off the coast here. So, and I just can't think of her name now. Marie something was a famous communard, and she got transported there and ended up being involved in the Kanak, which is the native island people of New Caledonia called Kanaks. So, and that's not their official name. That's what they're called, and they've adopted that name. And she was involved in an uprising against the French in New Caledonia. Eventually, a lot of them were pardoned and went home, as she did, and she wrote about it. So I plan to follow that up in due course. So there's so much that has been made of the commune. So what is Marx trying to draw out here? This isn't a blueprint for how you have a working class government or how you should go about running a working class government, but it does reveal the sorts of things that working class people did when they took power. There's clearly a critique of the state as not something you can just take over and run. It was a terrible defeat, bloody defeat, but It's a question of what we learn from that working class practice for that short time. And this is a historical experience from which we need to learn. It's not a set of doctrines that we can draw, this is what they did in Paris, therefore this is what we should do. It's the sort of principle. And as he says, the martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. That's how the pamphlet or the address ends. I thought there was more to this confidential communication when I skimmed through it. There is, of course, a whole lot of letters and discussion in the movement about the meaning of the commune. And I thought that's what this internal document covered. But when I looked at it before class today, I realised it's mainly focused on Bakunin and the danger of sectarianism. So that's an important, debate in the movement, right, about a sect form as opposed to the party, as opposed to, representing the working class and all those debates. But so it wasn't quite as informative as I had thought. So that's my 2 cents. So over to everyone else.
Okay.
I think Jeff's first, then George.
First, I've always been very puzzled by the history because the number of killed in the commune was horrific. Apparently, the blood was streaming down the streets because it's very, very steep streets that you can see from the top of Montmartre. It was horrific. And yet, what puzzles me is that when Thiers died in 1877, his coffin was taken through the streets of the old commune, and people came out to pay their respects, large numbers. I don't understand. I have no clue as to why that should happen. I wouldn't feel that if
No.
around me. I wouldn't want to go out and pay my respect to the killer.
An old communist friend of mine once said, a lot of people, he was talking about a famous union leader here, said, a lot of people went to the funeral just to make sure he was dead. That was...
But are we discussing the 1881 letters in this or class? I'm not sure. The letters
which one? Whatever the name was, the Dutch name or that one? I covered off some of the letters in chat, but there was optional ones this week as well. That letter you recommended.
Is that part of this discussion?
Yeah, we can do it next week. Yeah, it was going to be a discussion week. I assume everyone's on board for that.
So next week, okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something, Shane. You presented the very important data concerning the massacre of the participants in the commune, of the up-risen working class workmen. Doesn't that correspond precisely to the prediction by Marx that I mentioned, that it would be a desperate folly to rise up? That's that was Marx's recommendation. Be careful, workmen. Don't rise up because you are going to be massacred. We know who these guys are. Thiers and the others. They are killers. And the provisional government has Republicans participating, and he says that they have very clearly in their mind the memory of the June insurrection. And supposedly he knows that they are going to respond in the same way by massacring any kind of insurgents.
Yeah, that's right.
And I suppose the idea in a kind of uprising is not to celebrate the dead heroes afterwards, is to have them alive and possibly successful in running a government or perhaps taking some kind of power control. Not celebrate them as dead heroes.
No,
for the memory of the future generations. In class struggle, in other words, you have always to take into consideration the objective conditions
Mhm.
and the balance of forces and the spirit of your opponents.
Mm.
If they are killers, you have to take that into consideration. You don't want to
Yeah.
slaughter a sheep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just for the name of an ideal, let's say.
yeah, I
Anyway,
know what
we
you mean.
know that revolutions are protracted processes that take centuries, possibly,
Mhm.
or many decades.
Yeah.
It's not a kind of, spontaneous eruption that let's see what may happen. That's an anarchist logic.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is an anarchist logic, not a Marxist one.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Bill?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, I've always thought that Marx was wrong on that. On the ground, on whether or not they should have rose up, because I think they were right to rise up. And I think, with these things, you can't always just turn it on and off like a tap. There's a certain flow, and sometimes you just have to go with the flow. So that was an interesting point. I mean, I think, kind of if you look at the kind of comparison, I suppose you have Trotsky and Lenin in the July days of 1917, where they were against an insurrection on the grounds that they hadn't won the majority of the population yet. And then they waited a couple of months and they had won the majority of the population and they did stage an insurrection. But of course, it was still extremely bloody. There was a civil war. Lots of people, it was extremely bloody and it didn't end well either. But you kind of think, well, what other choice did they have? I don't think they did have any other choice. So I just think, sometimes it's just you have to accept that people want to fight and it's not optimal and you can't just tell them to go home. And it's the way it goes. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of I've always thought that about Marx, that perhaps his tactics were not as good as, say, later people like Lenin and Trotsky, who I think are the greatest tacticians of revolution, especially Trotsky, even more so than Lenin. So that's my opinion anyway. So I think that's interesting, because obviously they were very great students of this event and they did study it intently. I think these things are not so easily, and obviously it's the benefit of hindsight, and you can't really. I mean, people say, "Oh, they should have done this, they should have done that," as if they were in a position to judge. Someone was saying, "Oh, Trotsky was wrong about the British general strike in 1926." Blah blah blah. And I think, how many general strikes have you led? Trotsky had led maybe 10 general strikes in his life. I think he knows a bit about leading a general strike. So it's all fine. I mean, and that's not to say, of course, he's always right. But I mean, who am I to tell Trotsky? You see what I mean? I think that is something to think about personally. So yeah, I think that is an interesting thing, and I think it's kind of irresolvable, really, in as much as we're looking with the benefit of hindsight. It's 150 years later. It's very, very difficult to assess it concretely. Anyway.
Shane, you're muted.
Shane, unmute yourself.
Okay, apologies. Yeah, I was going to say, that doesn't mean that the fact that it was maybe a predictable outcome doesn't. We need to also focus on the fact that these people were butchers and completely unnecessarily killed large numbers of people. You know, like that's the other side of it, isn't it? Jeff.
Yeah, it's a question not of blood, because a revolution, as Engels said, is the most authoritarian thing that there is. But it's a question of the position. And in the Commune's position was one which was extremely difficult. A parliament had just been elected where there was an overwhelming majority of monarchists, and for the next 4 years, it was almost certain, it was felt certain that France will be a monarchy. If you're going to rise a revolution in Russia, it wouldn't be against an elected parliament. It was because there'd been a breakdown of order that a revolution was successful. And the reason that Lenin fled in July 1917, he had a pretty good disguise if you've seen the photographs, but the reason he fled was because there's a reason he opposed the rising. The circumstances were not right. Now, you can't stop people. In Germany in 1919, there was a revolution which Rosa Luxemburg opposed from the Spartacists, but the Communist Party, which had just been formed, insisted on this putschist tactic, and she was killed for it. It reminds me of a story. One of my in-laws was the son of the Grand Rabbi of Vienna and fled Austria in 1938 during the Anschluss, but his aunt was a teacher in Vienna at the time of the Spartacist rising, and she remembered the children coming dancing in, these teenagers, girls and boys, singing and shouting, "Hurrah, the Jew bitch is dead." And she just had to sit down and started crying. She didn't take the news in the way that they did. But Rosa Luxemburg opposed it. What George said, was said by a guy called Thomas Müntzer. Thomas Müntzer led the German peasants' rising in 1525, and they all marched on an armed army. And there were thousands of peasants, and they marched singing Christian hymns because they were told that if the cross was before them, there was no need for guns. They would defeat the opposition. They didn't. There were thousands slaughtered. And Müntzer was captured, and before they took him off to do whatever horrible things they did to people in those days after capturing them, Müntzer made a speech renouncing the peasants' rising on the grounds of one thing. He said, "I had never known the depths of cruelty to which these rulers were prepared to descend." He said, "I knew they were swine, but not this type, not the depths of the evil to which they're going. We shouldn't have risen." I would have said next time, get guns rather than if you're going to rise. But nevertheless, it's was tactics of just a secondary point. The election business of the commune wasn't an accident, recall, etc. The ideas were very much in the air. They became established in America in the early 20th century in progressive states like Wisconsin and California, where recall and referendums and direct election, rather than allowing a party to choose a candidate, direct election by primary was pushed forward. And it was pushed forward as a measure against the robber barons, which had arisen in America, people like John D. Rockefeller, John Pierpont Morgan. It was said that this was a means of democratically controlling these people. And it failed, of course, but became reactionary. I think that these constitutional mechanisms are just mechanisms. What matters is the context and the spirit which moves them. And the commune was premature. As Marx said in 1881, he said he'd advise the commune, negotiate the best you can. That's all you can do. Rising is just cutting your throat. It's a suicide mission.
We've still got a few minutes if anyone else wanted to comment. other thoughts might be like, if we're going to discuss the implications next week, do we have a sort of framework to do that in? That would be the other thing.
Shane, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I can't. I tried to get on earlier, but I'm not getting this hand to work for me. Yeah, I just had a couple of brief comments. If it's time for me to make them, or I'll just hold them.
Yeah, here you go.
All right. Well, firstly, on this discussion, Marx, on the question of folly, that communal folly, I think what's missing from a lot of discussion on that is that Marx is coming from and basing it on a very detailed analysis of the unfolding reality. He's merely making a judgment on that basis. He's not telling anybody what to do or killing it. He's just proceeding from that analysis. And at the same time, I think he recognizes that, that doesn't mean that he makes correct analysis, that people are going to necessarily do what the analysis says. I mean, people are going to respond to real situations, and their response is not always informed by analysis. So, it's just real. And he should have did it, blah, blah, blah. That's a bunch of crap. It's a lot of yap about people who don't understand or haven't taken the time to understand the real process. And, that's one thing. The other thing that was really instructive that came through, and not for anything, but when I read this, it resonates with what the advice Marx gave when he made his presentation in Value, Price, and Profit. And he informed people right away, and I think it's very important. If you don't do anything, you better inquire into the power that you're dealing with. Do you have the power to match the power you're dealing with? And back in the old League of Revolutionary Workers, Black Workers days, we had a saying: don't sell wolf tickets, in the struggle. If you can't back up your talk, keep your goddamn mouth shut. You know what I mean? And that was that it was always proceeding from the standpoint of, can we match their power? Can we match their organization? Do we have the influence? And if we couldn't win that battle, then we laid low, and so forth. Revolution is not a triumphal march. It's a marathon. Yeah. Okay, that's it.
George?
Yes, I have written down two criticisms of the structure of the commune, but perhaps since we are going to dedicate a discussion next week, I'll write them up as in a PowerPoint, so present them in a more systematic way. Okay.
Okay, that'll be good. I might just stop the recording and we'll have a